Today's episode of the Counselling Tutor Podcast is sponsored by Web Healer. You're a counsellor in private practice and you need a website, or you've got an existing website which you need help with. Web Healer are offering Counselling Tutor Podcast listeners, that's you, £100 off the cost of a website design and build. Now, Web Healers specialize in websites for counselors and psychotherapists. It's what they do. And the Web Healer team provide a completely non-technical, done-for-you solution, leaving you to focus your time on your clients. Operating for 20 years, Web Healer are a trusted resource amongst counselors when it comes to getting your practice online. So get the package details and claim your £100 off coupon for your new website by going to counsellingtutor.com/website. That's counsellingtutor.com/website.
Hi, I'm Rory and welcome to episode 325 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Neurodivergence and autism are increasingly essential topics of CPD as practitioners are becoming more aware of a previously overlooked group of clients who may be autistic or neurodivergent. In today's episode, I'm delighted to be joined by Bernie Wright and Lisa Smith from NED Training, who will discuss their lecture they created for the CPD library titled Eating Disorders, Disordered Eating and Neurodivergence. Essential information for anyone who's working with neurodivergent clients. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Ken.
Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for counsellors, psychotherapists, and counselling students. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hello and welcome to episode 325 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Both Rory Lees Oakes and myself, Ken Kelly, are delighted that you've lent us your ears. 3 topics on today's journey, starting off with ethical, sustainable practice, where today we're going to be delving into the realms of attachment essentials for counsellors. We then go on to the CPD section of the podcast. That's called Practice Matters. Rory's already introduced Lisa and Bernie. They're going to be speaking about eating disorders and neurodivergence. Definitely worth a listen for that one. And then we go into student services, recognizing you are your students on your formal journey to become a counsellor. And, we recognize that it can sometimes become overwhelming. It can become a burden, all the studies and supervision and placement hours. So we're going to be having a look at that. But let's start off, Rory, let's kick us off for today into that attachment theory in ethical, sustainable practice.
Yes, thank you, Ken. And as you said, it's not something that's often taught in first trainings, in my experience. Although I'm kind of self-taught, we did actually cover it. But attachment theory is a fascinating theory of how infants, little children, bond with their parents, and that bond kind of lays the path for how they bond and interact with people in their future. If they have a very good form of attachment to a caregiver, then there's very likely that as they turn into adults, they will have good relationships or be able to sustain relationships with others. However, that isn't always the case. And, when we used to look at attachment theory with our students, Ken, it was quite a revelation. A lot of students realised that their attachments with their caregivers weren't as solid or as healthy in some cases as they may have been. And then they went on to realise, of course, that this has impacted on them as adults. And I'm reminded of a quote by Søren Kierkegaard. In our house, we speak of little else, of course. And that is that life has to be led forward, but viewed backwards. And what he meant by that is our life today is foundationed by our past experience, and certainly our relationships that we have with others are almost certainly, the foundations of those are found in childhood. And that is why attachment theory and understanding attachment theory is so important.
Thank you, Rory. And I guess I can gain from that, and having some knowledge of the subject, having taught it alongside you, that attachment theory lies in our development as human beings, and it kind of keys back to maybe what we experienced as we were children, maybe even before our memories are formed. So it's unlikely that we would look at ourselves without understanding attachment theory and recognize our own attachment unless we delve into it. It kind of becomes invisible to us. So you mentioned secure attachment. That is a person that is maybe quite balanced, and a secure attachment would kind of be less. I don't want to say problematic, because it's a theory and it's just a mixture of people and we're all different. But within secure attachment, it's kind of the person might be okay with themselves, decisions they make, decisions or comments and feedback from others wouldn't trigger them. But how does that attachment form in those early years? What causes the attachment to form, Rory?
Well, I think that's very interesting, and there's a number of theories that have been put forward. But before I go there, I just want to say a good way of thinking about attachment, certainly if you're an adult, is I'm okay, you're okay. Borrowing that from transactional analysis, but it literally is that. You're right in yourself, you feel secure in yourself, and when you're with others, you feel secure with them. I'm okay, you're okay. And what can happen is that people who have faulty attachments, they either themselves don't feel okay in relationships, or they feel not okay with others. I think that would be a very simplified way of using a TA theory to explain what attachment is in adult life. But to answer your question, it started with John Bowlby. Bowlby was a psychiatrist who himself had a very poor upbringing. I think he was sent to a boarding school in the 1940s, which must have been horrendous in those days. And as a consequence of that, it set him on the path of trying to understand what happens when children are separated from their mother. And in fact, he wrote a book called The Nature of the Child Tie to His Mother. Notice he used the word his and mother. And one of the things we now know about attachment theory is that, of course, all sex and genders have attachments, and it's not only to the mother. But I think it's fair to say that Bowlby's view of attachment was biological. And in fact, he argued that the attachment theory was intrinsic in increasing chances of survival. Now, as we move on, Ken, we see that there's a different view to a biological attachment. Almost certainly there is a biological attachment, but there are other theories which we might look into and discuss. But that's the basis of it. And Bowlby, indeed, after the Second World War, he did a piece of research on refugees, something which, of course, is a topic in our society today, child refugees. And I think it was for the World Health Organization at the time. And he came to the conclusion that children who didn't have an attachment could find themselves in some difficulty. So that's the basis of it, Ken.
Yeah. Thank you. And I like how you referred it to I'm okay, you're okay. And that being a secure attachment style, I guess. So I feel okay about myself, and I'm not threatened if somebody's information bashes up against mine. If I disagree with you, it's okay. I look at you and I go, I'm okay, but you're okay too. You are entitled to that opinion, and it doesn't threaten me. I might take that information, consider it, and I might change my opinion, or I might not. I'm okay with that. It's kind of a pretty laid back type of, my understanding, pretty laid back kind of person. And then, of course, we have I'm okay, you're not okay. So these are the TA terms that are used, meaning I can't trust anybody. If you want a job doing, you've got to do it yourself. I'm really suspicious about people. If you say something and it bashes up against what I believe, then I'm going to go, well, what do you know? Because I'm okay, you're not okay. What do you know about this thing? And then, of course, the other side of that is you're okay, I'm not okay. I don't feel okay in myself. I don't feel confident in the choices, the decisions I make, what I say. I look to others for validation within that. So if I have an opinion or a thought on something and you say, no, that's wrong, it's actually like this. I might look and go, well, I'm not okay. You're okay. All right. I'll do what you say. Am I understanding that correctly, Rory?
Yes, you're absolutely right, Ken. That your understanding is completely correct. And I think what you're referring to is the development of attachment theory by Mary Ainsworth. So in the 1970s, a researcher that worked with Bowlby started to develop her own theories on attachment, and that person was Mary Ainsworth, very famous, very accomplished child psychologist. I think she's a child psychologist. And in the 1970s, she started a piece of research called strange situation. And the strange situation procedure was where a child would accompany the mother, or mother would accompany a child into a room with toys, and then the mother would leave, the child would be on their own, and a stranger would go into the room. And what would happen is that the researchers would observe how the child reacted to the stranger, and also when the mother came back, observe the behavior of the child towards the mother. And she split attachment into effectively three ideas: secure attachment, which would be the I'm okay, you're okay. And the child feels confident that the caregivers, the mother is okay, not too distressed, maybe a little bit kind of puzzled about the whole thing. And then you have avoidance attachment, where the child, this would be an avoidance attachment would be I'm okay, you're not okay, if we use those TA terms. And it would be that they would avoid perhaps the mother and would show very little distress during the separation, would be kind of distant from the mother. And then you have something called ambivalence or resistance attachment, which is you're okay, I'm not okay. And the child would be maybe clingy, difficult, feel very distressed during the separation. And that became the predominant idea, certainly in social work, through the 70s and into the 80s, about attachment, Mary Ainsworth. So yes, we are borrowing TA theory, and I have to say, before anybody writes in, the OK Corral is not really, the I'm okay, you're okay, is not really about attachment, but we're borrowing it for the purposes of explaining attachment in the podcast today. They are two separate theories, said. but it's a useful way of explaining what it is, simplifying it, if you like.
Thank you. And I guess what I'm looking for now is, how does this apply to therapy? So I remember that one of the exercises that we did when we were teaching together, Rory, is we would encourage our students to identify and understand their own attachment style. And it was really, really interesting. And there's great personal development within understanding and exploring your own attachment style. But how does it actually translate into actual therapy when you have a client coming in and maybe that client has a certain attachment style? What might we see? What are the clues that we're looking out for, Rory?
Well, that's good. I think that's a very good question, Ken. I think, first of all, is the relationship that the therapist and the client has. One of the things that I always have in my mind when I practiced was, how is our relationship, and what from the past may be being played out in the relationship. So, if I'm working with a client and, they may get very distressed at the idea of leaving, or distressed at the idea that therapy may come to an end and he might not see me again, that could be that could be ambivalent attachment played out, in that the person may be reluctant to leave what they perceive as a caregiver, if that makes sense. Also, it may be that you have on the opposite side someone who's avoidant, and they come in and maybe they're not connecting, and maybe through the arc of the relationship you have with the client, they may very well not make a connection with you. And there can be lots of reasons for that. There's lots of different theories why this is, but they are something to hold in the back of your mind. And secondly, relationships with others. A lot of therapy, in my experience, and I don't know about yours, Ken, focuses on the experiences that the client has with other people and in relationships especially. And, sometimes you may get little nuggets of information that the client reveals in therapy, such as, I'm in real trouble with relationships, but, certainly, it might be a female client, or it could be a male client saying I'm having relationship troubles with men. And it might be that the father wasn't very present in the childhood. Or it could be the opposite. I really have a difficulty with intimacy with women. And that could, again, be a sign of a difficulty in the past. They may say, well, my mother was very cold to me and she didn't have much time for me. Or I was one of a very big family. This is something that comes up a lot. One of a very big family. So, yeah, my mum did the best she could, but she had to spread herself out a bit for all of us. And now I feel that in relationships, I just don't feel connected. I just don't feel the person is connecting enough to me. That speaks to attachment. So there's quite a few things there to consider, Ken.
I'm very grateful to have the super duper Rory made handout in front of me over here, and I'm going to share from that. So with secure attachment, in which the client is able to describe their experience and their feeling, how it made them feel fully and in a balanced way. So they have access to their feelings, they're able to bring that, they're not holding anything back. Avoidant attachment, in which the client is unable to elaborate on anything, providing only minimal answers. They're holding something back, or they don't feel that they're able to share that. So they'll be sticking to the facts of what's going on in their lives rather than going into and touching on their feelings. Because you mentioned the word trust, and I think this all boils down, for me, this all boils down to trust. I'm holding a little bit back because I don't fully trust. And then with the anxious attachment, the client talks quickly, incessantly, and it's really difficult for you, the therapist, to follow and to make space for any intervention. And I think I can certainly relate, looking back on my practice, I can certainly relate to seeing all of those types of presentations. And it doesn't mean that they necessarily fall under this theory. Like you quite rightly said, Rory, I mean, there are other factors that come into play here, but understanding the theories at least gives us maybe more of an understanding of where that client might be coming from. So if we are perhaps with a client and we're in a session and we suspect that a client might be acting from a certain attachment style, is there anything that we can or should be doing as a counsellor, or is it just a matter of noting that?
Well, I mean, it depends on the situation, Ken. Personally, I wouldn't jump in immediately. I would look for a pattern of behaviour in a client. And if that came up, I might reflect that back. I might say, in the person-centred tradition, I might say it seems that there is, that you have a great difficulty. It's a bit of a struggle for you to connect with people emotionally. And you mentioned that you had a difficulty with your mother or your father in the past. Could there be a connection there? Try and help them join the dots. And sometimes when I've done that, people have gone, you're right, actually. You're right. I didn't have a great connection with my mother. And as a consequence of that, or my father, and as a consequence of that, I kind of wonder if that might be it. I mean, nobody really would know. I mean, they're only theories after all. But sometimes it is helpful to join the dots, Ken. And I'd like to also say something about cultural competence here, because attachment theory is a very westernized, Eurocentric idea. And in African cultures, there's an idea of allo-parenting, and that involves childcare responsibilities amongst multiple caregivers. And the late Nelson Mandela noted in his book that when he was young, he would be suckled by many women. In other words, offering the breast to feed the child. It wouldn't just be his mother; to be any woman who was bearing milk. And when a child needed to be fed, they just pick them up and put them to the breast and feed them. So we have to be thoughtful that from some cultures, collective cultures, the idea of allo-parenting, attachment theory may not be a really good fit. And I think, all therapists need to be culturally competent and not kind of overlay Western Eurocentric ideas on clients who are not from that sphere of the world, if you like.
Thank you, Rory. And kind of one more area that I'd love to touch on, and that's I'm okay. I'm not okay, but you're not okay. That is a person who doesn't trust themselves, doesn't trust those around them. What might we see in that kind of an individual? How might they present or show themselves in the world? Because that's a horrible place to be. I would imagine living in a world where you don't trust yourself and your own abilities, and you don't trust anyone else that gives you advice or guidance. It kind of sounds very lost.
It's a terrible thing. The phrase is terrified, and someone who's terrified at the same time as being very lost and alone. And what you're alluding to is the work of Means and Solomon in the 80s, the last big piece of attachment ideas, and that is disorganized attachment, where a child may be in a situation with a parent where they're either having to be the parent even as a little child because the parent isn't capable of parenting, and or they're in a very abusive situation. And horrified and terrified is the way it was described to me when I did my attachment training. So this idea of not being able to trust self, mainly driven from the fact that they didn't have any agency when they were children to be able to make any changes because they're only little, and then horrified about what was happening around them. And I think with people who have a disorganized attachment style, it can take a long time for them to integrate themselves. They're effectively, part of them is lost. The part of them that trusts themselves isn't there, is lost. The part of them that puts their trust in other people is lost. So I think for someone who explores that, it's about consistency of the therapist, being consistent in the relationship, being the good enough other. There's a term coined called the good enough mother, and it's been changed to the good enough other now. But being consistent, and I think this is where psychotherapy really excels, because what you're doing is you're doing reparenting. Effectively, you can do it as a counsellor. I'm not saying that's not possible, but it's not going to be 5 sessions. This is going to be a long-term engagement where the therapist becomes the secure object, and that work is done very thoughtfully and contracted and boundaried, and the client realizes that this is going to be a long-time piece of work. And from what I've read and from what I've discussed with colleagues, there isn't an absolute cure for this. It's going to be something that may be managed, not cured.
Thank you. Yeah, and that bit that you've just said there, as we come to the end of this topic, there's no cure for this. And I recognize, personal development, part of that is looking at how we can better ourselves. And I know as counselors, psychotherapists, we focus on that, and we can understand our own attachment style. We can work around our own attachment style. We can maybe change the behaviors that might come up when we're put in situations where we see that attachment style come up. But you mentioning there's no fix, it doesn't go away. And in times of extreme stress, when we lose the ability to think clearly, there is a reverting back to that original attachment style. And I certainly see that within my own life. I'm okay, you're not okay is my attachment style. And I have to check that all the time. And I see it come up often within my life. And when I see it, I am able to modify my behaviors around it. But when I'm stressed, when I'm under pressure, when I'm not able to think correctly, I revert back to that attachment style. And after the fact, I will look back on my interaction and go, there it is again.
Yeah,
and that can be pretty tricky, can't it?
It can be, Ken. And I mean, my own attachment style is avoidant dismissive. I mean, people listening to this who would be nodding in agreement. But yeah, and you make a very good point about reverting back. So what therapy will help you do from a neuroscience point of view is build new neural pathways. In other words, new ways of thinking about yourself. And I think good therapy will allow somebody to be aware of why they're feeling how they are. So in situations nowadays where, I might be just thinking, well, I'm going to get my bag and go, I'm off. I have the awareness before that kicks in to go, well, this is just attachment. And, we've been here before, Rory, and, just give it a few minutes and it will pass. And generally speaking, it's all good. But in extreme stressful situations, the new neural pathway you build through the work in therapy to manage your attachment may not be available to you. So you go down the old road, effectively, the old neural pathway, and that's what happens. So I think, in summary, as a therapist, the best you can hope for, and I think managing client expectations, is that they have an awareness of why they feel that attachment pull or push, depending on which attachment style you're at. And they're able to be aware of it. It comes into awareness, and they're able to manage it. And I think that's what we're talking about. There's no cure, but people can manage it. People can understand the process and manage it. And that's the path of personal development.
Thank you, Rory. And thank you for bringing this topic. And you said the golden words. When I trained in attachment theory, you mentioned those words. And that's the thing, we're called on to continuing professional development as counselors and psychotherapists. This topic is so important, and it shows itself so often that we have made training on this. You made the training on this, Rory, and it is available. If you're a student in our student library, that's the counselling study resource. It's available there as a lecture with available resources and further reading. And if you're a qualified therapist, we have a qualified CPD library, and it's available there as well. Now, generally, we would use qualified lectures for qualified therapists, and they would differ from what we would make available for students. But this topic is evergreen. It doesn't go away, and it shows itself all the time. So if you're a member of our student library, log in and pop in attachment into the search bar. You'll find it. If you're a member of our qualified library, do the same. Log in, put in attachment. Now, we've got a handout for you, one of Rory's super duper handout. I've got it in front of me here. It's Applying Attachment Theory and Research in Counselling Work. It covers the key figures in attachment theory with all the dates, which is great for assignments, that, Rory, if you're writing about it. The attachment dynamics and the developmental pathways. It talks about secure attachment, disorganized attachment, the use of language. All of the different attachment styles are kind of listed there. There's a lot on the importance of trust, and most importantly, a pile of references if you want to dig a little bit deeper. If you want to get that super duper handout, it is free. Go to counsellingtutor.com, just click on the podcast tab, go to episode 325, that's today's episode, and you can download that and put it in your CPD file or have it on hand. And I encourage you, identify your own attachment style. There's a lot of fun in that and a lot of personal development.
And one final thing, Ken, I did nip into the Counsellor CPD library, which is our library for qualified therapists. And as well as my lecture, there's 2 other lectures on attachment delivered by different practitioners who give us a slightly different handle on it or come from a different perspective. So well worth watching all 3. I think I enjoyed. I watched one the other day. Thought it was wonderful. So it's well. I was watching it, thinking, "Oh, I wish I'd have thought of these ideas." Yeah, it's well worth. If you're a member of the CPD library, just typing in attachments in the search bar, and all those lectures will come up, and all the other resources on attachment, and you can get a really good sense of what it is and how to work with it.
Yeah, the good news is you can access all of those lectures, and they're significant in-depth lectures with learning outcomes and references for deeper reading. You can access all of those lectures for less than the price of a cup of coffee for 2 per month at the CPD library. Just go to counsellingtutor.com and all the information is there. Just click on our products tab. You'll see all of our libraries there. So that is ethical, sustainable practice for today. We're now going to the CPD section, the free CPD that you can kind of log with your ethical body. And today in Practice Matters, we're talking about eating disorders and neurodivergence. You introduced this beautifully before, Rory. You met up with Bernie and Lisa to discuss this very important topic.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, neurodivergence is now becoming an emerging topic as clients who are neurodivergent are now being seen more. It's becoming something that every therapist, in my view, should be clued in on. And we know that eating disorders and neurodivergence, there is a link. There's some really strong research that link them together, which is why I was so delighted to speak with real experts in the field, Bernie Wright, who's a therapist, and Lisa Smith, who I believe is a nutritionist. And they talked about their lecture on eating disorders, disorganized eating, and neurodivergence, which is a lecture that is available right this minute in the CPD library we've just discussed. I caught up with them, and this is what they had to say.
Practice Matters is proudly sponsored by the Counsellor CPD Library. To access top quality, relevant continuing professional development for your practice that you can do at a time that suits you, and all for less than the price of a cup of coffee, visit counsellingtutor.com.
Today I'm thrilled to welcome Bernie Wright and her colleague Lisa Smith, who have created a thought-provoking lecture in the Counsellor CPD Library. Their work delves into the fascinating and important connection between eating disorders, disordered eating, and neurodivergence. So Bernie and Lisa, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Rory. Great to be here again, really is.
Thank you for inviting us.
Oh, it's no problem. It's always lovely to interview two people on the podcast. So I guess the first question I'll ask Bernie is, why do you have this interest in disordered eating and neurodivergence? What was it that kind of sparked your passion for that?
That's an easy one. I was actually many years ago. I was in a placement, Rory, and I was working with a young person who clearly had a lot of sort of emotional issues, and very lovely lady. It was at the end of my training, and I would add that I was a trainee at the time. Mm-hmm. And I made the mistake of saying, "Would you like me to help you with anything else?" And this person said, "Yes, I'd like you to help me with my purging and my vomiting," which was which was absolutely very chronic at the time. I had no idea. So after that, I made a mental note, so never to actually ever forget to ask someone what relationship we would like with food, weight, and shape. And then as soon as I went to National Centre, and I was clinical lead there, as you know, for a long time. And along that path, Lisa and I really kept realising there was something missing. And we both got a huge amount of experience in the eating disorder world, but there was a level of rigidity and difficult to connect, and lots of sensory issues and problems, which we knew already. I'm extremely neurodivergent myself. So we just decided to set up NED, which is all about neurodiversity and eating disorders and disordered eating. And that's what we've been doing ever since.
So so it sounds like it's a real specialism of yours. And I know you've done lectures for us before. So, Lisa, neurodivergence seems to have just arrived very quickly into the language, into the awareness. Certainly 20 years ago, if you'd have mentioned neurodivergence, you would have got blank looks even 10 years ago. And to some extent, I think even 5 years ago. It's a very new phenomenon and has uncovered, I think, a cohort of people that was probably invisible or not served. Would that be a good summary?
Yeah, I think so. I think the people were always there, Rory. They just weren't, sort of identified. And I think what happened was really is where COVID, the epidemic came in, because then it's when the neurodiverse individuals sort of connected together. You'd got, especially through the social media, and what happened is people realised that they weren't on their own, that there were other people with similar experiences to them, and of course then you've got this little more. We had this sort of the mental health awareness, that people became a little bit more aware, a little bit more understanding. Maybe having a little bit more curiosity instead of, making judgments. And I think it's allowed it's given the neurodiverse individuals that little bit of trust to come out and speak. So people say, it's been diagnosed a lot more. Yes, it is. But now we're actually looking at the right criteria of the diagnosis, where before it was just, it's a adolescent male. Females don't get it and you grow out of it. Well, no, females do get it. They're just much better at masking. And adolescent males just learn coping mechanisms and strategies as they get older. So it's always been there. We just never identified it, recognised it, and then said, OK, how are we going to sort of embrace and work with this?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree, certainly. I would agree it's always been there. I've recently been assessed as neurodivergent. Who knew? Apparently everybody. My daughter has a formal diagnosis of autism, and my grandson also has a formal diagnosis of autism. So clearly it's always been around, but now it's, I think what you're saying, Lisa, it's more in the public awareness. It's more being discussed as a consequence of people coming together during the lockdown. So Bernie, the link between disordered eating and neurodivergence, for many, many years, people have always talked about bulimia or anorexia as if it's something that stands on its own. But it seems to be that there are clear connections between disordered eating and being neurodivergent. What's the background to that?
That's a great question, Rory. And it seems to me that as we look at it, there's probably about 1 in 3 who are anorexic will be neurodivergent. And 60-70%, I would say probably even more, who are bulimic, or because that's more sort of chaotic and impulsive, which might be more linked to ADHD. And we've missed it. And the link is so much so, if you look at the sort of the ADHD, for example, which I am, and that impulsive, that hyper focused, and we've made we haven't seen that link. And if you miss that link, Rory, then you won't be able to support the client. So, for example, therapy fundamentally would have failed for me in some ways in the past. If they'd have actually asked me to do a food diary, go and do a food diary, Bernie, or do this or do that, or eat every 3 hours, or whatever they tell us to do. But of course, so if you're hyper focused like somebody like myself is, I would need structures. I'd need a therapist to know how to say to me, let's think about sending a picture in rather than if you can't write, because I'm also dyslexic, and just making it really easy for the person. And we were saying to the anorexic person, for example, we kept saying, do you hear a voice? Or that's your voice talking. That's the voice of anorexia nervosa who's telling you what to do and sort of bullying you. And of course, for the autistic person, that is often far too abstract and too literal, and that they just couldn't understand what we meant. So if we didn't see that link, we'd miss the client, because it just seemed to be they're genetically. If you think about if someone's impulsive or rigid in their thinking, then they're far likely, for example, to be impulsive and have that Well, you explained, Lisa, about that they're more likely to want the dopamine hit, so that looking for the reward, so to speak, which we talk a lot about in all of our work that we do.
Yeah, I mean, ADHD is all about dopamine, Rory. It's about dopamine balance and imbalances. And, there's a lot of genetics, not single genes involved, but there are genetics involved with both autism and ADHD. But around ADHD, it's predominantly to do with dopamine. So dopamine is that reward, it's that motivation, it's that, the body saying, do I like this and do I want to do it again? Now, the issue with dopamine is if you don't have enough, if you have some and you break it down too quickly, or if you have some but the body can't use it, the brain is constantly going to be seeking dopamine, and it will encourage people to behaviors that actually provide dopamine. So if we look at it from eating, that is sugar, salt, high fat processed foods, caffeine, and then you've got your nicotine, and recreational drugs going forward from there. So it's behind those addictive and impulsive behaviors, because the area of the brain that works with dopamine also works with impulsivity. It also works with the prefrontal cortex, which is where logic and reason and rationale and learning from experience and consequences live. And obviously, if we have a little bit of a lapse in there, those things don't happen. We don't see the bigger picture. We don't see the consequence of doing something. We're just getting this impulse to do it, but it's not being driven by a lack of willpower or simply a blood sugar craving. It's being driven by a hormone or neurotransmitter imbalance.
Oh. That's crazy. And there's also that thing about, isn't it, with autism, for example, so it will be perhaps in so many people, that black and white thinking. Mm. And of course, if we get it wrong and say, do this, do that, this is the way to do what my training said, to work with eating disorders and disordered eating. And of course, people would take you very much like, that's what I need to do. And then we can always push them into that real rigidity that would create more problems down the line, or lots of people who are autistic will use food as sort of a stim to calm themselves down. Like some people would be flap their hands all the time, or, I will sort of just move a lot because I'm very, very sort of physical. But we need to support people who stim. And if we don't actually, they may be just using food as a stim. Will you explain that, Lisa, when it can go wrong, badly wrong for them?
I think one of the key places I see that we can get it wrong is not understanding the neurodivergence issues with hypersensitivity. Mm-mm. So if you have somebody that is hypersensitive to taste, texture, noise, light, all of these things, their nervous system is more easily overwhelmed. And therefore, if you've got somebody that is eating food that is bland and easy to chew, so it doesn't challenge from the motor oral skills, and many autistic individuals have problems with that, then you can see why they could be drawn to those foods. And unfortunately, those foods are, the processed, bland foods that we see in the fast food outlets. Mm-hmm. I always say there are burgers that taste the same anywhere in the world. I have a client that eats soggy cornflakes because they never, ever change. Their texture, their taste, it never changes. So it never challenges her. It never adds that one more thing that she's got to deal with. So I think when we're looking at the bigger picture of the neurodiverse individual, it's a matter of looking at that. They are individuals. That's the whole thing. There is no protocol. There is no set, this is the path you go down, because everyone is absolutely unique.
Yes, absolutely. And it strikes me, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of people listening, maybe wanting to ask the question, that if someone comes to therapy and they say, I've an eating disorder, or they may not use those terms, I have trouble eating, or I overeat, or I regurgitate the food I've eaten, which sometimes referred to as bulimia. Is first two questions really. The first question is that automatically mean that they're neurodivergent? That's the first question. The second question is, how do you broach the fact that someone who may not know they're neurodivergent, how do you broach that to say you might be neurodivergent? Because that might be a really difficult one. So the first question is, I guess, is disordered eating always a consequence of neurodivergence?
No, But no, absolutely not. And there's an awful lot of neurotypicals who have got disordered eating and eating disorders. However, what we do, and that's a great question, Rory, because we have to be so careful. So we never put people on the spot, so to speak. So we might say to our client, lots of people say that they felt left out at school, or they felt that they were different. Does that ring true for you? Or lots of people we work with will overeat when they're under stress or pressure, or comfort eat. Does that ring true for you? Or lots of people might say that when they were accused of being scatty or easily distracted or impulsive. So you may go down that sort of very, very light questioning. And also you will also very much at the beginning, invite lots of people have problems looking at me. Please feel you can look away. So you pick it up really quite quickly in the assessment process if you do it right. And then basically then you work from there on in. And for some people, Rory, it is inappropriate. I mean, over the years I've worked I did a panel a couple of years back. And for the 6 people, they were all neurodivergent, autistic, ADHD or both. And for one of the particular people, I knew it would be totally inappropriate to say that it was like the nose on my face. But that very same person 2 years later is out there loud and proud about being autistic. But it's choosing the pace.
Yeah.
For the client.
Yeah. So I'm getting the sense that you can ask sensitive questions.
Absolutely.
And that may not set a light bulb going, but maybe in the future it's part of the process of switching it on. They may say, "Oh, my therapy," because those would be discovery questions you probably ask a lot of clients in the discovery process as you are making an assessment as a private practitioner. But it is a tricky one because you don't want to be in a position of diagnosing.
Exactly, because that's what we can't do. But as a rule of thumb, Rory, if I'm 100% convinced in my mind, and Lisa would be the same, and yet there's a sort of a reluctance to, because you just, as a therapist, you get pretty intuitive about knowing when, not always, of course, but I always say when I'm training, Lisa always says when we're training, is to treat someone as if they are.
Yes.
And that's a fundamental easiness.
No, I think you made an interesting word there that a lot of people's ears will prick up. You use the word treatment, and that's something of an anathema in the counselling world, isn't it?
Oh, yes.
Yes. So if there's anybody listening and they're thinking, I think this is an area I'd like to get into. Clearly, you've done a couple of lectures for us in the CPD library, but this particular one on the link between neurodivergence and disordered eating is the one we're referring to. But this isn't certainly not a training course. It doesn't equip you to be an eating disorder specialist. So on behalf of the audience, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of people nodding their heads or not in the headphones, what does equip you? What training pathway would equip you to work effectively and ethically with eating disorders and neurodivergence?
That's a very, very good question, Rory. And it's a case of it's absolutely essential that you have the training. And I did like the fact that about the word treat. I think what we would mean probably as working with eating disorders and disordered eating, and if the client is neurodivergent, it has to be so person-centered. So I was, to start with the 2-day training that we do, and then to think about more intensive training going forward. But as a rule of thumb, you need to, you need to know the questions that you need to answer that are safe and ethical, and that can pull out an eating disorder and it's like, the very basic questions like, as you're sitting in front of me today, 0 that you don't think about food, weight and shape at all, 10 that you do, where might you be on that? Also, we have to be careful with people who are autistic because that scaling may be difficult. So there's lots of amazing, fantastic books out there, and our diploma course has gone down like an absolute it's gone very, very well, and we've got some great people out there now who are also trained with eating disorders and can actually work in a person-centered way with a neurodivergent individual. Would you add any more to that, Lisa?
Yeah, I would. I think, people from a therapeutic world might wonder why I'm sitting on this conversation. And I think one of the things Bernie and I sort of didn't pick up at the beginning is when we started working together all those years ago, it was so that we could offer support in both a psychological, physiological and nutritional way. So the three-pronged approach really sort of helps to move somebody along the road that they want to go on to get better. But I think it is so important, just as with the therapist, that the nutrition person they're working with has experience and support and knowledge in this, because there is times that the nutrition industry can actually make things a lot worse by promoting orthorexia, always looking at this perfect diet and this ideal diet. And we don't live in an ideal, perfect world. And with people with neurodivergence, ADHD and autism, you're putting unrealistic expectations on them that just can add to anxiety and further create problems. So I think it's really important that if they're looking to get nutritional support, and this isn't just from the diet, this is about looking how the body functions and what the body needs to function properly, that they are making sure that the nutrition element of that is also got experience of working with both eating disorders and neurodivergence.
Yeah, so it's a joint approach, the psychological side, but also the more kind of scientific side, the nutritional side, information about how the body processes food. That makes perfect sense, because it's a two-sided coin, isn't it? Disordered eating. One is managing the emotional aspects of it. The other is more practical interventions. And for those of you who are interested in the training delivered by Bernie and Lisa, if you go to Counselling Tutor, go to the podcast tab, look at episode 325. If you click on that, you'll find all their details in the show notes, and you can peruse their website and peruse their offering. And if that area interests you, then there is an opportunity. As we come to the end of this interview, I wonder what you hope that those who watch the lecture, what they'll take away from it.
For me, and working, I was trained as a humanistics therapist, and it's something about meeting the clients where they are in their world, not ours. That's the easiest way I can look at it, really.
Yeah.
For me, I have a saying that I'm known for, which is be curious, not judgmental. Just be curious about that person sitting in front of you and I wonder why they do that. I wonder why. And then just open out that, because you can pick up so much information sometimes by asking that additional question.
Absolutely, 100%.
Well, the important connection between eating disorders and disordered eating and neurodivergence is available in the Counsellor CPD library, and it just goes to thank Bernie Wright and Lisa Smith for joining us today. I'll go again on that in 5, 4, 3. The lecture, The Important Connection Between Eating Disorders and Disordered Eating and Neurodivergence, is available in the Counselor CPD library now. And it just goes for me to thank Bernie Wright and Lisa Smith for a thought-provoking and fascinating interview. So both, thank you for joining us.
Massive thank you to Lisa, to Bernie, to you, Rory, for holding those all-important discussions and bringing them to the Counselling Tutor podcast. And just a reminder, if you're interested in having a look at that lecture, just pop over to Counselling Tutor CPD library. That is available for you right within that. And if you are interested in neurodivergence and specifically maybe working with autistic clients or clients with autism, we have a course, and that's also available. Just go to counsellingtutor.com and you can get all the details for that. Moving out of practice matters right into student services. Student Services is sponsored by Counselling Skills Academy. Can't tell you how many times Rory and I have heard counselling students say that learning skills and knowing that they're using them effectively is really, really challenging. The reason for this is because we don't get to see another counsellor using skills in a real live session. In reality, this means that we're asked to learn something that we can never see demonstrated in a real setting. And it's no wonder that many of us are left feeling unsure. If If you want to see counselling skills used in real sessions by qualified therapists, so this is real sessions, real presentations, and real use of skills, then go to counselingskillsacademy.com. There's some free videos on skills, including a full live session that you can have a look at. Gain the competence and the confidence of knowing you're using your counselling skills effectively. Just visit counselingskillsacademy.com. And today in Student Services, we recognise you, counsellors, on your formal journey, and we recognise that it can become overwhelming, that it can be burdensome at times. And we certainly see comments on this, sometimes around presentation time, skills evaluation time, assignment submission time, final portfolio submission time. We see that the tone in our Facebook group, Counselling Tutor Facebook group, kind of changes, and lots of people panicking, feeling really stressed. How do I manage this? How do I balance my work, my family life, and my studies at the same time? And it can feel like a burden, Rory.
It can do. And we also see comments like this usually in January. And I suspect that people have had some time off. They may have a couple of weeks off. And then they like the freedom, they like the idea of being off and not studying. And then January comes and bang, they're back into class again with all the assignments, all the presentations. And, for some people, I think that it can feel like a burden. If you're doing diploma or degree or master's degree, they're very, very intense courses. You're not only having to manage, clients, you could be seeing clients, the coursework, but also the shifts in your own perception of self. And all these can weigh very, very heavily. And, sometimes, I don't know about you, Ken, but I've certainly had people turn up to my office when we used to teach saying, I want to give it up. I'm fed up. I don't want to give it up. And I would sit them down and let's have a cup of tea. And I'd say to them, right, what is it that is the difficulty? And once people have talked it through, usually what happens is that they retain the passion and their why. Why am I doing this? And they retain that and they go away and usually they pass. They go on to pass, and in lots of my students' cases, have stellar careers in counselling. I think sometimes people just fall out of love with the subject, and when people fall out of love with it, it's like any relationship; it does feel like a burden. And I've had conversations with students, and they've said, "I just don't want to do this anymore. I want to go on a different path." It's not me, it's not you, it's me conversation. It's like a breakup conversation.
Yeah.
And I would say to them, well, look, give it a couple of weeks. Don't do anything rash. Take some time, put your studies down. We're not too worried about, assignments, assignments being submitted. Have a think about it. And some would come back after a couple of weeks and say, that fire inside me is rekindled and, I want to go again and fine. And they'd go off. And some would come and say, it's journey's end, and I want to do something else. And my question always was, what is next? And what will you take away from what you've learned? And it's amazing. A lot of people have gone into very diverse areas. I had a student who was a paramedic and she actually passed, but she went on to, I think, develop her understanding of the human condition in her other role as a paramedic, which was her first love. And I've had people who've gone to be social workers, drug and alcohol support workers. I had one very talented guy, but he just wanted to help people in recovery, and he felt he could be more useful training in that area, not in counselling, being in a different helping profession. So it does happen. And I think it's the fire in your heart, the passion, when that flame goes out, I think it can be very difficult to reignite it. And if it does go out, sometimes I think it might be better to look at a different path. But a lot of people, after a couple of weeks, fire rekindles again and they're off on their studies. But it is tricky. And yes. And for some, there'll be some listening now thinking, do you know, that's me. That's me.
Yeah.
Rory's just described me to a T.
Yeah, it's an important topic, this, Rory, and I'm really glad you brought it, and I know why you brought it as well. I'll give you a secret for those listening to the podcast. The way Rory gets the topics is he goes and looks in the Counselling Tutor Facebook group and looks at what you guys are talking about right now, what you're asking, and that informs what we bring. And this is a topic that comes up again and again and again. And for me, the saddest is when somebody embarks on a studies to become a counsellor. They've got a very strong why of the reason why they want to become a counsellor, and then right near those last hurdles decide to leave because of the overwhelm of the training, because of the assignments, because of the work of getting the hours in on your placement. And the message I'd like to share is that studying to become a counsellor is not the same as being a counsellor. You're a student. You're in an academic organization. And really, you're doing a counselling obstacle course where you have to jump over some little barriers and you have to make your way through the tunnel and you've got to evidence your learning, and there's a whole lot of boxes that need to be checked and ticked by the academic organisation for you to get through. On the other side of those studies lies a piece of paper with your name on it that says that you are now a fully qualified counsellor. And it becomes different. There's still a requirement to learn in our continuing professional development, but we're then out of the study assignment and all of the box ticking. So there is a reprieve on the other side of the studies. And many courses that you do are tricky. You know, there's a fallout in any course, whether it be bricklaying through to doing a master's or a PhD. There's dropouts. My daughter is currently doing her master's, and she came home over the festive period and says, "Oh, I don't know if I can make it through. I don't know if I want to do this anymore." Well, she said that the year before when she was doing her final year of her degree. And she said that when she was in college. And she said that when she was at school going through to her final exams. It is a temporary. Now, what I'm trying to get at here, sometimes we can make decisions that arise from a temporary situation that have permanent outcomes. If you leave your course and go, "That's it, I'm leaving, I'm not going back to that," that's it. You know, you might be feeling that overwhelm and leave, but that's it then, really. Unless, of course, you return back to studies and you might need to redo something there. So there is a reprieve on the other side of that. That's the one thing. Prevention, I believe, is better than cure. What is it? Easier. What is it? Prevention is better than cure. Is that the same?
Prevention's better than cure. That's
there. You go. I've got to get the right term, else we'll get the
that's
letters
your
in.
axiom right there, I think.
Thank you very much. And there are a number of things you can do to prevent overwhelm. But before we get to what you might do to prevent overwhelm, I'm going to speak about when in overwhelm. And I'm going to ask you, Rory. So if I'm a student right now and I'm looking at this and go, "Oh, and I can't do it, and I haven't got it, and I'm just going to babble on here." What I'm trying to show here is I'm completely overwhelmed by my counselling studies. I don't think that I'm good enough. I've got terrible insecurities within myself of whether I can do this. Part of me, a little part of me, doesn't want it anymore because of this massive barrier. Who should they go and speak to, Rory?
Well, I mean, depending on which level of counselling we're talking about, but if it's practice-based, diploma, degree or master's degree, I would suggest that they initially speak to their tutor. Book a meeting with your tutorial, and explain what's going on. There is a good reason why on practice-based courses you're asked to do your own personal therapy, and that is because part of this overwhelm can be what's being raked up through the theory that you're applying to your own life. You know, you know as well as I do, Ken, that when you teach theory, you're teaching the soundtrack to people's lives. And what happens is they hear that and they go, oh, that's my life. And they see themselves from a different perspective, and that can be, and others from a different perspective, and that can be quite overwhelming. So personal therapy is helpful. So tutor first, personal therapy, if you have a personal therapist, and if you're in supervision, maybe worth just bringing it up to your supervisor. And because there can be lots of different aspects to overwhelm. So overwhelm can be, I just can't handle my own personal process. I can't handle the academic side, or I can't handle the client side. I've seen a lot of comments about people, feeling less than when they're working with clients. And all those people will be able to help you look at that perspective and be able to maybe manage it. And what I would say, and I always said this is my own little kind of theory, is that counsellors aren't taught, they're forged. And they're forged in the fire of personal development. And one of the things I was very grateful for, and I felt like quitting, I've talked about the beans 3 times a week, beans on toast 3 times a week, and the struggle of being a student. One of the things I was very grateful for is it made me more resilient. So when you're working with clients, what can happen is that you need to draw on that resilience that's been instilled in you through training, rather like a soldier doing basic training, which is really difficult. And then when you go into combat, probably not a good analogy, but I think it's one that people will understand. They could draw on that for resilience. As therapists, we really do need to be resilient. But if you're listening to this and you're feeling overwhelmed, go and see a tutor. Go and talk it through. Talk with your peers, trusted peers. Maybe if you're in therapy, speak with your therapist. If you're in practice and it's the overwhelm is about working with client material, see your supervisor. Start off by working out where the overwhelm is. What part of yourself is being overwhelmed? Is it the academic side? Is it the personal side? Or is it the practice side? And then once you've found out what it is, then get the support you need.
I like that. So look and find the root cause.
Yeah.
Because what we're left with is the overwhelm, the feeling, and I had it myself. I convinced myself just before handing in that final portfolio that I didn't really need to get a qualification as a counsellor because I'd learned so much and I was so grateful for what I'd learned and what I'd been able to apply to my own life. And I remember speaking to my wife about that at the time. And she reminded me by asking me, why did you start this training in the first place? And I replied that I started the training because there was a period of my life when I walked through a very dark road and there was somebody who was kind enough to put a hand into that darkness and help me out of it. And I wanted to do the same for others. And just in revisiting my why, I thought, right, okay, let's just go and knuckle down and do it. But I wanted to leave because I felt the overwhelm. I felt really, really, really uncomfortable. And I shudder to think, had I gone, you know what, I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to do that final hurdle. Well, there wouldn't be a Counselling Tutor podcast and you wouldn't be listening to this today. We wouldn't have created Counselling Tutor. We wouldn't have helped tens of thousands of students just like you. So you have the ability to make a difference in the lives of so many. And that's what this is all about. Look, if it's really not for you, as Rory started off in the beginning here, then so be it. It's not for everybody, but it's difficult for a reason, because being a counsellor is a challenging place to be. And we deal with discomfort as counsellors because there are clients sharing sometimes horrific parts of their life with us. And this counselling, learning to become a counsellor doesn't turn off your emotions. You're still there in an empathic human being, and it sometimes can be quite challenging. So, but you should have a kind ear with your tutor if you practice based with your supervisor, and of course, as you've mentioned, Rory, your own personal therapy, great places to visit. So that is what happens if you're in the overwhelm now. However, prevention, going back to the axiom, is better than cure. What do I mean by this? Well, if you know what to expect and you know what is coming, then you're better prepared. And what do I mean by that? Well, if you look at your year ahead, right at the beginning of the year, and if you're listening to this in real time, you're kind of at the beginning of a new year because we've just entered 2025. Look at what are the requirements on you. So look at what your studies requirements are. Look at the dates that assignments need to be put in by so that you can put them in a calendar so that you can look before there so you're not caught unawares. So if you're prepared, you have a better chance of riding the waves, the bumpy waves, the choppy waves. We have the Counselling Study Resources, which was built by Rory and I because we taught shoulder to shoulder and we saw within our own students similar challenges coming up again and again and again. We built the Counselling Study Resource to help students that are doing formal counselling training. And the absolute gold, the gold in that Counselling Study Resource is what we recommend you do first, and that is the academic writing course. It's a course built by a counsellor who trains counsellors, sharing about the academic writing process. And she very kindly shares how to do your year planning and how to understand what your course might bring up for you. And we always recommend that if you join Counselling Study Resource, that's the first place you go. You just log in, go to My Courses, and it's there. It's a free course that we bundle in with the study resource so that you're prepared for it. And then there's one other thing that I think is really important. Choose your friends carefully when you're training to be a counsellor. And this is in life generally. Who are you listening to and what are they saying? So if you're surrounded by people going, oh, this is so hard. Oh, I'm so overwhelmed. Oh, I can't manage this. Oh, this is so difficult. Oh, I'm thinking of leaving. Then there's a saying that says we become the sum of the 5 people we spend the most time with. Yeah. Then maybe that would rub on us. That negativity might rub out on us. Can you maybe align yourself with students on your training that are excited about the training, that know that it is challenging and difficult, but are pushing through regardless? Peers that will support you when you're feeling insecure about your studies, and peers who you can support when they feel insecure around their studies. I look back on my journey, the peers and the friends that I made on that training course, some of them I'm still in contact with today, and I can look back and I can see where I was held, where my legs couldn't go any further, Rory, and I was held by my peers and supported by my peers over difficult ground. And I'm very, very grateful for that. So choose who you surround yourself with when you're studying and the messaging that you listen to while you're studying. And then one last thing, and it's around that messaging, is you may get to a point in your studies where you're nearing the end and you think, oh, let me start looking at what happens next. And then you start looking around. Be careful of negativity around working as a counsellor, getting job as a counsellor. There's plenty of it out there. There's a lot of messaging that will say, oh, there's no jobs in counselling, or you don't get paid well in counselling. Ignore that. If you've got the right motivation behind you, you will become who you need to become, linked to the why which started you on this process in the first place. So there's some thoughts from my side, Rory.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you're absolutely right, Ken. Try and associate yourself with positive people, and people who'll carry you. Radiators, people who are radiators, who transmit warmth, as opposed to vacuum cleaners who suck the life out of you. So yeah, always look for positive people. And I always say, but I was asked recently for a quote from my bio for the Counselling Tutor page, counsellingtutor.com, about the team, and have I got any kind of words of wisdom? And the only words of wisdom I could come up with was, never let your fears get in the way of your dreams. If you started on a journey, it's because there was a reason for that. There was something that pulled you into the classroom or piqued your, piqued your interest, and keep hold of that, your why. Never let your fears get in the way of your dreams. And one sunny day, usually in August, you may be stood there in your cap and your gown with your family around you at the graduation, and you can look back on your journey, the good parts and the bad parts, and say, look, I made it. I'm here. I've graduated. And, what's next? So try and hold on to those things, and just stick with it. That was always my little mantra to myself. Just stick with it. The training doesn't last forever, and it can, and it has changed people's lives.
Yeah, you can do this. I know you can do this. Listening, if you're feeling overwhelmed, you can do this. Have you ever heard the saying, "It's darkest before the dawn," Rory?
Oh, yes, we're getting all the axioms out here, aren't we?
It's this axiom episode here. Yeah. That's there for a reason.
Yes.
It almost seems like whatever we do that is worth doing, that has a really good impact on the world, there is an element of resistance that might come up on that journey. And it seems that it gets, the resistance gets stronger the closer you get to the finish line. If you're running a marathon, you're most tired before you get to that finish line. It's just the way of things. There's a beautiful book. I don't often recommend books on the Counselling Tutor podcast. This might be the second time. It's a beautiful book. It's got nothing to do with counselling. Not a thing. It's called The War of Art. It's by Stephen Pressfield. It'll be available on Amazon or wherever you buy your books from. It's a tiny little thin book, but it's about resistance, facing resistance, and how anything that is worth doing that is going to have a massive positive impact within the world will tend to have resistance before it. I don't know why. It's kind of a universal law that if you're wanting to do good in the world, it gets difficult before you get there. And I wonder if it's not about the right people getting through, because you have to go through that resistance. You said forged in the fires of personal development, Rory, because a counsellor who doesn't make it through that resistance, maybe they weren't supposed to be on the other side of that, but you can do this. You really can. That's Student Services, and this has been episode 325 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. The National Counselling and Psychotherapy Society, or NCPS, proudly sponsor this podcast, supporting students every step of the way. Join the NCPS for resources, training, and a friendly, knowledgeable community to enhance your learning experience. Visit ncps.com.
Yeah, we started off with ethical, sustainable practice, and we discussed attachment essentials for counsellors, why it's important to understand what attachment theory is and how it might present in your therapy room. And we did discuss those 3 wonderful lectures on attachment in the Counsellor CPD library, which are very helpful, and of course our continual professional development. In Practice Matters, I spoke with real experts, Bernie Wright and Lisa Smith, on their lecture, which is in the CPD library, Eating Disordered Eating and Neurodivergence. A fascinating interview, but an even more fascinating lecture that is really, really helpful and very pertinent in a world where neurodivergence is becoming more recognised and more talked about. And then finally, in Student Services, Ken and myself had a wander down a number of axioms on when counselling studies feels like a burden, and shared our observations of what you could do to support yourself if you feel you're in that position, and give you some maybe some encouragement. I hope we've given you some encouragement to stick with it and to look at the end and to graduate your studies. If you found this episode helpful, why not share it across your social media platforms, be it X, be it Facebook, be it LinkedIn. We always like and hope that our people will like our content so much that they will share it so others can benefit from the conversations that Ken and myself have, and the input that you give us for the topics we choose, the people in our Facebook page. And also, I'd like to thank all those people who've been so kind to leave reviews on Podchaser or iTunes or anywhere where there's a review of the podcast. Thank you very much to those people. We really appreciate it, and it really makes our day when we log in and we can see someone has really benefited from what we've done. So thank you to those people. And as always, stay grounded. Stay safe.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. Counselling Study Resource, or CSR for short, is the world's most comprehensive assignment guidance and study support resource for students just like you of counselling and psychotherapy. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode by visiting counsellingtutor.com.